Today I want to talk about the 30-year mortgage scam because this is really the kind of thing that has led us to the housing bubble that we are in today. At least it is partially responsible, along with inflation and monetary policy from the Fed, as well as quantitative easing. I guess you could say they're all responsible for the housing bubble that we are in. However, when things can be financed long term, and when there are subsidies for anything, including government subsidies like there are for mortgages, well, that makes everything more expensive. We see it with mortgages. We see it with student loan debt. And what we're seeing right now is young people are taking longer than ever to reach homeownership status in their life. In fact, only 50% of millennials are reaching homeownership pretty much right now this year, which is later than any other generation. I mean, I'm a millennial, guys, and I'm almost 40 years old. The oldest millennials are already in their 40s, and the youngest ones are in their, low to mid 30s. So that's pretty late to own a home compared to previous generations. Not that owning a home should ever be your number one goal in life, or it means that you're somehow a failure if you don't own a home. As long as you have other ways of building wealth, doesn't really matter in my opinion. But the problem is nearly 1/4 of millennials expect to rent forever, not out of choice, but out of necessity. And if we take a look at how the 30-year mortgage came to be, it definitely shows you that has led up to a lot of the problems that we're all facing right now. So 30-year mortgages never existed until about the 1940s or 1950s. Prior to then, nobody got a 30-year mortgage. People got like 5-year mortgages for their homes. They paid them off, and that was it. But after the Great Depression, the economy was in the tank for a couple of decades, and this was a way to kind of re-stimulate growth in the economy. Sound familiar? As well as to promote homeownership. And fast forward to today, about 70% of all mortgages are backed by the federal government, which means that our mortgage system and our housing market is essentially a form of central planning rather than free market lending like it should be. One thing that the Trump administration wants to do is they want to make Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac private again, because they used to be prior to the GFC. And if that happens, I believe that you're going to see mortgage rates go up a lot higher than they are right now, because private lenders are going to want a serious return on their investment, not these Mickey Mouse 6.3% returns on mortgages that are backed by the federal government. That's why mortgage rates can also be as low as they are, because once a lender originates a mortgage and the whole deal closes, they go ahead and sell it off to the federal government, and then it's their problem. They deal with it 70% of the time. And so going back to when the 30-year mortgage started, yes, it did make homeownership more accessible and more people were able to afford and buy homes, but it also locked people into 30 years of debt and paying way more interest than people have ever paid in their entire lifetimes for anything. And lenders realized that, hey, this is a new way to make money. Like, for example, if you buy a $400,000 house today, which is not far off from the median price home in the US, at a 6% interest rate, that $400,000 house ends up costing you anywhere between $690,000 and $830,000. And then, of course, you have other government-backed programs today, like FHA, where you only need to put 3.5% down to become a homeowner. Or if you're a veteran, you can put 0% down with the VA loan. Same with the USDA loan, which means that your payment is going to be even higher than somebody who put down 20%, because now you're financing a larger portion of your mortgage. We're also going back to a time where there are low income subsidies where people can put 0% down for mortgages if you make a low enough amount of money. I mean, go figure, somebody who doesn't make a lot of money gets to buy a house for 0% down. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Because if you don't really have a lot of money, how are you going to afford the higher house payment? And really, how are you going to afford all of the expenses related to the house once you actually own it? That's what I would like to know. But because we have the 30-year mortgage, it kind of artificially stimulated demand for housing and allowed people to buy a lot more house than they could really afford, which has driven prices up tremendously over the past 70 or 80 years, way beyond income growth. Because if buyers can borrow more, then they can bid higher prices on the homes, which raises prices, and lenders capture all the profit because they're the ones lending you the money. And guess what? They're collecting interest on a higher loan balance than ever. And it's really in the lender's best interest to have as low of a down payment as possible, because the more you finance, the more interest you're going to end up paying over the years. And so the longer your loan term and the lower your down payment, the more profitable it is for the lender. And then by the 1970s, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac institutionalized mortgage securitization, which created a massive secondary market that was hungry for debt. And then we can see how that all turned out in the early 2000s, right before we had the GFC, because we had a ton of subprime loans, interest-only loans, no money down loans, and even ninja loans, meaning no income, no job loans. That's literally what that stands for. And that's what was going on back then. That was what led up to the big housing crisis that we had, and why prices got so far out of control and then ended up crashing down. And just take a look at how things have changed. In the 1970s, the average American home cost $26,000 and the average income was $9,800, meaning that you could essentially pay for your home with 2.5 years of income back then. Today, the house is $410,000 and incomes are $83,000, which means now you need about 5 times your annual salary in order to pay for the average home. And I think a lot of people just don't really realize how much interest they're going to end up paying on the house over the life of the loan. And even that is accounted for in many cases, because if you are a homeowner, you can deduct up to $10,000 annually off your tax return and deducting the mortgage interest. So sometimes people don't even care because that's a deduction. And if you think this is going to go away anytime soon, don't hold your breath. In fact, FHA borrowers who are having a hard time paying their mortgage as it is are already getting loan modifications to go from 30-year mortgages to 40-year mortgages. And I could easily see this being something that everybody has access to within the next decade as housing and incomes become more and more detached from reality. I wouldn't be surprised at all if more people had to start financing for longer terms. You're already seeing it in the car market, and there's so many parallels with the car market and the housing market. And if people already have to get, 7 to 9 year car loans in order to be able to afford cars today, well, that's coming to the housing market most likely, where people need to get 40-year mortgages to be able to buy them.